So this video is going to take us through cell structure. What we're going to be doing is describing the major functions of various eukaryotic cell structures. You should be completing your guided notes while you work through this to make sure that you have a full set in addition to your 7-2 guided notes. So first of all, terminology. Organelle literally means little organ, and it refers to the small structures that are within a eukaryotic cell. So as we go through and talk about things like lysosomes and vacuoles and your nucleus, we're looking at those tiny organ-like structures that we find inside eukaryotic cells. The word cyto, or rather the prefix cyto, is also something that's going to come up a lot for us. So we know that there's cytoplasm, there's a cytoskeleton, and that's because cyto is actually a Greek prefix meaning cell. So the reason that you see it pop up a lot in reference to your cells has to do with the fact that it does actually mean cell. So the first structure we look at is your cell wall. The cell wall is composed primarily of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates like cellulose and pectin. Cellulose you are responsible for. You should be familiar with that term. There's also proteins that are embedded within the cell wall as well. Its primary job is to provide structure and protection to the cell. And we find it in plants, algae, fungi, and most prokaryotes. So most bacteria also have a cell wall. We do not find a cell wall in animal cells. And this is how we can kind of differentiate between our different types of eukaryotic cells, plant and animal. Right here we have a couple images of your cell walls. So starting all the way over on the left-hand side, we have kind of a cartoon image that shows two cell walls, which are in green. The cell membrane would be the orange, inner, thinner layer. We notice that in between the cell walls, because they are these thick carbohydrate structures, there are these tunnels that form to allow cells to interact with one another, and these are called plasmodesmata. In the center, you're looking at a TEM image. So this is a real image of a cell wall underneath. And then all the way over to the right-hand side, this is similar to what we would have seen with our Allodia. So this is a plant, and these are all the cell walls that you can see outlined in green. The next structure we're going to look at is the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane is also called the cell membrane. So you may have heard the term cell membrane multiple times. We should be familiar with using these interchangeably. Depending on the source you're reading, the textbook, you may hear cell membrane, you may hear plasma membrane, but they both mean the same thing. So what does the cell membrane do? The cell membrane is responsible for controlling what enters and what exits the cell. This is such an important job, and this is why we find cell membranes on every single type of cell. So it doesn't matter prokaryotic versus eukaryotic, plant versus animal, every single type of cell has a cell membrane. Because in order to maintain homeostasis, so maintain an internal balance, organisms have to have the ability to control what comes in and what goes out. And they're doing this at the cellular level with the cell membrane. So the most common image that we are going to look at in this class of the cell membrane or the plasma membrane is what you are looking at on the upper left-hand side over here. This representation is called the fluid mosaic model. So we notice here that when we look at the cell membrane, we tend to think of it as this smooth kind of uniform shape, but it is not at all. You have your phospholipids, which in this diagram are shown as having orange heads and two yellow tails. We learned about these in the organic molecules unit. So these are lipids. They're hydrophobic or water-fearing. And we notice that they make up most of the cell membrane, but we also notice that there are a lot of these blue structures that are embedded in here as well. And those are the proteins that we're going to find in our cell membrane. And these serve a huge range of jobs. Some of them are going to be involved in communication. Some of them are going to be structural. Some of them are going to be involved in transport. But we notice that the reason this is called a mosaic is because I've got a nice image down here of a tile mosaic on the bottom corner of your screen. Like a mosaic is a bunch of small sections of tile that come together to make a big picture. Your cell membrane is a bunch of different organic molecules that come together to make a singular structure. So they work cooperatively, they work together in order to perform this function of controlling what goes in and what goes out of the cell. So we're going to look at the specific structures inside the cell membrane, so talk generally about what they do. When we do cell transport a little bit later, so towards probably February, we'll again go back through all this information. So this is kind of a preview. So the first type of organic molecule that we find in the cell membrane are your phospholipids. Again, we talked about these in organic molecules as being lipids. So these are here they are purple and blue. So if we had the purple head and then the two tails that come off, one of those structures right there is a phospholipid. And because they have hydrophobic, hydrophilic portions, they're going to actually control the movement of water and ions in and out of the cell. The second type of organic molecule we're going to find in our plasma membrane or cell membrane are proteins. And I'd kind of talked a little bit about what proteins do. So proteins are one of their major functions is to act as passageways to allow larger molecules to move in and out of the cell. So things like glucose, which are the sugars that we get from our carbohydrates when they're broken down in our digestive system. Those are much too big to just squeeze through the phospholipids to get inside of our cell. So what we have are these special protein tunnels that are going to allow these big molecules or these very charged molecules to come in and out. So they're acting as transport across the cell membrane. The last type of organic molecule that we're going to find in our cell membrane is we find carbohydrates. So carbohydrates are going to extend off of the proteins and identify passing molecules and cells. So if you look on the diagram that we have on here, you'll notice that your proteins are in kind of that reddish purple color, and then we have these blue chains that come off of them. Those blue chains are your carbohydrates. Those are kind of like satellite dishes that are going to pick up signals from neighboring molecules and cells and transport messages inside the cell. And this is how the cell is going to partially maintain homeostasis, by being able to use the signaling system to change according to what the environment outside the cell is like. So, recap. We have our lipids. Those are our phospholipids in our cell membrane. We have proteins in our cell membrane, and we have carbohydrates in our cell membrane. So hopefully we're starting to get a little bit of a picture of why it's called a mosaic model. We have lots of different types of organic molecules that come together to perform this very big function of controlling what goes in and controlling what goes out of the cell. The next structure we're all familiar with, your nucleus. So the nucleus is going to contain all of the genetic information for the cell, and it's also often called the control center. What we're going to talk about now is maybe what we might not be so familiar with, and that's why DNA is so important. So why is it that this structure that's just basically a membrane, so just like we had our cell membrane right there, we have another one of those, but it wraps around our DNA. So why is it so important? Why is it the control center? And it has to do with what DNA does. So DNA, inside your DNA, there are sections of it called genes. And what your genes are is they are directions for how to make a protein. Just a quick reminder here, again, if it's in red, that means it goes in your notes. So you should kind of find the section up where we're at DNA so far, check to make sure you've caught up. If you are missing any sections, you can rewind, go back, but make sure you get a full set of notes. So these sections of your DNA called genes are essentially the recipe for how to make one protein. And there's a rule here where it's one gene equals one protein. So we have thousands and thousands and thousands of genes in what is called our genome, which is the term to describe all of the genes in an organism. So each of us has our own individual genome, which is just basically an assortment of what recipes do we have inside our cells. And then, because of that, we can figure out what proteins our cells are going to make based on those recipes. Proteins are important because they're the major component of organisms and they're essential to life. So they're going to do things like transport things in and out of your cell. They're going to actually physically make up structures like your muscles and your skin. Those are primarily composed of proteins. Proteins are also all of your enzymes. So chemical reactions to keep you alive cannot occur fast enough without your enzymes, without proteins. So these the recipes to make all of these hugely important molecules are essential to life. When we look inside the nucleus at the structure of our DNA, what we find is that there's actually two different types of DNA structure we find. We find that in non-dividing cells, the DNA is spread out and it's not visible. And when it's all spread out and not visible, we call this DNA chromatin. So when you look inside the nucleus of a cell and you don't see anything, so it looks like it's empty, it's not empty. It's just that the DNA is has such low density, so it's so spread out that you just can't see it through your microscope anymore. And again, that's in non-dividing cells. In dividing cells, what's going to happen is the DNA is going to condense, coil back on itself very, very tightly, and form those X-shaped structures called chromosomes. But again, that's only in dividing cells.